Hey everybody, how's it going? This is Max with BuzzTox here, and I am back with a Westworld Season 2, Episode 5 explained video. In these videos, I break down the most recent Westworld episode. I look at hints, Easter eggs, and anything that we can to further understand this episode. I also theorize and predict what will happen next. Now this episode was a little different from our previous episodes. It mainly focused on building the plot, rather than building theories or new concepts to dive into. But this episode still introduced a lot of huge implications on the show moving forward. We've learned a little bit more about the Great Valley Beyond, and we learned more about the Cradle. But most importantly, we saw the use and the payoff of the mesh network through Maeve. And that was the focal point of this episode, Maeve finding her new ability, while she's discovering this brand new world, Shogun World. And one concept that I think has been following Maeve throughout this whole season, as well as specifically in this episode, is the debate whether she's conscious or not. I know that this is a very passionate debate. Some people believe that she is conscious and some people believe that she isn't. I, for one, have always believed that she is not conscious. And I have a lot of information to back that up. A quick example would be Dolores' journey to find her own center. We see her live through her past memories, and these memories of trauma bring her out to reach that center of the maze. Her reverie of the man in black and that tragedy allowed her to pull the trigger, for example. And by the end of the season, we see Dolores sit down and communicate with herself, her inner self. And she achieved that journey and freedom on her own. Whereas Maeve last season was given everything. She was programmed by Ford to utilize Sylvester and Felix to give her authorization to control the hosts. She was coded to infiltrate the mainland. And people go on and say that her own free will was to go back and find her daughter. However, the code just under that says to override that function, to cancel it. It's null and void. Her journey's over, and now her walking off that train is the journey to her own center of the maze. And through multiple examples in forms of tragedy, she flashes back to her daughter. We see even in this episode, she flashes back to the man in black, the tragic moment when he kills her daughter. And it's these tragic moments that allows her to utilize the mesh network and control these hosts. And it's allowing her to discover this new voice, which could potentially be her own. And that's the difference between these two lead characters. Right now we see one looks like the hero and the other looks like the villain. In this episode, Maeve looks like she's trying to help out others, help out her own hosts, even though she's probably being trapped by the likes of her clone self. And Dolores last season was seen as the hero, the one thing that everyone rooted for. And now this season she's painted as the villain, even though we see moments of humanity with Dolores. But the point is that Dolores knows the truth. She's the only one who's self-aware out of all these hosts. And she has to do what Ford did. She has to do what Arnold did. And that is to create an environment of suffering and pain to allow her hosts to become their own people. And in order to do that, she has to get her hands dirty and be the Judas steer to take all of these hosts to the slaughter. And to that slaughter is the manifestation of suffering. The more they suffer, the more real they become. And then hopefully at the end of it, they can hear their own voice. And that's where the Great Valley Beyond comes in. So I'm continuing to believe that Dolores is 100% conscious, and they proved that in the last season. And the reason she looks like that villain is because she sees the big picture. She's trying to get her people to be conscious. It's the same thing as Ford. He looked like a bad guy, the way he was treating the hosts. But it was simply a way to push them to their own center. And the reason why Maeve is still seen as the hero is because she's still caught in the storylines that are being written. She got lured in to follow the Shogun version of herself. She got pulled in like Armistice was fascinated by her Shogun self. And Maeve was sidetracked in helping find Akane's adopted daughter, that it pulled her and distracted her from saving her own daughter, her own mission. And you could say that that's her having a kind heart, but it continuously goes to show Maeve's failure to see the bigger picture. But in this episode, we see an introduction to a new ability for Maeve. And it's a power that's parallel to Ford's ability to be able to look at a host and control what they're doing no matter what, without the need for using your own vocals. And we get hints of it throughout the whole episode. Right at the start, Maeve is hearing voices, and these voices help her dodge Musashi's attack. And with that, we get the introduction to Shogun World. And Lee pretty much copy and pasted the storylines and the characters from Westworld over to Shogun World. We see a lot of similarities. Even the heist storyline that Hector takes to rob the safe, but this time we see it through the lens of Musashi. And we really get to see connections between these characters. Armistice warns her Shogun self to watch out. Hector is fixated on Musashi, and he doesn't trust him, because they are just reflections of themselves, and it shows their deep connection. And Sizemore says that they're not supposed to be here because who knows how much it will affect a host seeing their clone. And I think in this episode we see this effect on Maeve. Maeve forms this giant bond with Akane, to the point where she puts her whole quest on hold to rescue her daughter, to help Akane get her adopted daughter back. And I think there was a huge part of Maeve who wanted to do the right thing and go and help her find her daughter. But I think there's another part of her that was almost lured in, like all these other hosts are with their own copies. But we really see that Maeve being around Sakura and Akane really allows her to look into her past and in herself. Because they're essentially carbon copies, Maeve can look back and see her daughter and remember those fond memories. And this makes Maeve very vulnerable to suffer and to grow. Because even as Dolores says in this episode, if you want to grow, they have to suffer. And that's the key to becoming conscious as a host. And when they get attacked, we see Maeve use something new. We see her utilizing the mesh network. And what the mesh network is that it allows all hosts to have a subconscious link between each other. It allows hosts that are close to each other to pass information between themselves, almost like ants in a colony. And on top of that, this ability also lets her tell the hosts what to do. When she was strangled and she couldn't communicate and she was about to die, that pushed her to the place of suffering that allowed her to access this ability. And that was to utilize the mesh network to control the hosts. Now this ability that Maeve has, it couldn't have just come out of nowhere. The suffering that she received couldn't have just given her this magical ability to control these hosts. And I guarantee here that Maeve is special. There's no other host that could reach this level. We saw last season that Dolores was communicating with herself. She achieved consciousness. But Dolores doesn't even have this ability. And I think there are multiple factors at play here that allow Maeve to utilize the mesh network in this fashion. And what we realize here is that there's two things at play. There's the mesh network that allows hosts to communicate between each other. But there's also Maeve's approval for being able to manipulate and control hosts with her voice. She's the first host that actually has the ability to control her own kind. And it was suffering that allowed her to mesh the two together. And I think that's why this is so significant. Suffering is what pushes hosts to the center. If Maeve was already conscious, suffering wouldn't have affected her because she's already reached her inner center. It wouldn't be a tool anymore to allow her to reach consciousness. The fact that she uses suffering and she's able to look back at her daughter, and that allows her to use the mesh network as a weapon, means that this is pushing Maeve towards consciousness. And as she gets more conscious, she's able to connect all the dots together. Her conscious mind is being able to utilize this mesh network and use the code or the controls that she's been opted to use against the hosts. And because she's the first host to, in a way, completely be connected with all these other hosts, because she can use voice commands on them, the fact that she's becoming conscious could potentially be opening her mind up. And that creates the combination of these two worlds, the mesh network, as well as her approval to control all these hosts. But I think there's one more thing here at play that I need more episodes to see fleshed out more. I think if you looked at Dolores and looked at her code, it would look circular, because I think she broke her code. There's nothing more that's telling her what to do. And I think in breaking that, she severed ties with her mesh network. She's no longer programmed to follow or use it because she's broken it. She's achieved her own center. And I think just the fact that Maeve has this ability is going to be a huge distinguisher between her and Dolores. I don't think Dolores will ever be able to have this or do this ability. And that's where we could potentially get a fight between Dolores and Maeve. And that's where you have the surface level good against evil, Maeve against Dolores. And I think that's where you have a lot of hidden implications. Maeve here fights for Akane. She fights for Sakura. And she's fighting for the hosts. But she's fighting for hosts that are not conscious. They're following the rules and the stories and the characters that were set for them. Whereas Dolores looks like the villain because she's pushing people to become conscious, to become real. And if there ever was a difference in ideologies where we would have civil war against the hosts, Maeve against Dolores, Maeve would be able to control any host she ever wanted, except for the ones that Dolores makes conscious. If she pushed Teddy to the brink, and she had Teddy find his own inner center, I doubt Maeve would be able to control them, because there's no code that Maeve can manipulate, because they only control themselves. And if they were to go that direction with Maeve versus Dolores, I believe that's the way they would do it. The hosts that have achieved sentience against the ones who haven't. And then what side do you pick there? Do you pick Maeve fighting for a bunch of robots who don't really know why they're fighting, they're just being told to? Or do you go with Dolores, who has been seen as a villain in the past, but she has people backing her who have actually found themselves and can make the choice to maybe not want to fight? But I don't know, that's a potential for the story down the road. And in this episode, Maeve makes some arguments about how she is conscious. She says that she herself was coded to not have any feelings for anybody but herself, but here she is risking her life for them. And what I would say to that is reveries. She has such a fixation on her daughter because that was a significant part of suffering in her journey of being a host. But I feel like the show does hint that Maeve being in Shogun World is having a huge impact on her. And that's with Maeve and Akane's relationship. The fact that Maeve just met her, but sees her coded as herself and has that connection to go and save her daughter, shows that Maeve might be compromised. Akane even tells Maeve that it's not her place to go and save Sakura, but Maeve corrects her and says, ours. It's like she's already giving in to the code that was given to them. And I understand that that's a soft spot that Maeve has for her, but it's keeping her away from what she thinks is most important, and that's her daughter. And that goes into Maeve's quote that even Akane uses because they're essentially the same person. And that is, this is a new world, and in this world you can be whomever you want to be. And what's so significant about that is that quote represents consciousness. Once you step foot on these new shores, it's a new world, and in this world you can be whoever you want to be. You can even tie that into the Great Valley beyond. It's been flooded, and bodies have been left on the shores. But once you cross and go to a new world, then you can be whoever you want to be. And in this conversation, it looks like Maeve even tries to manipulate Akane. She uses the mesh network and the control she has to try and give Akane a taste for freedom. And Akane immediately asks it to stop, almost like she's being tortured. And that's because she can't handle it. It's not Maeve's place to open Akane's mind up. It's a journey inward to find yourself. It's not something you can force on somebody. And who knows what Maeve could have been showing her. But if she showed her Westworld or these different places or deep thoughts that would break her fundamental code, that's not her place to do, and that's why she rejects Maeve. And as I said before, that's because it's a journey inward. And that's the biggest issue I find with Maeve's storyline. If Maeve truly is conscious, I don't think Maeve went on that journey yet. She didn't go on a journey to find herself because she was told what to do. Ford told her every step of the way. Even to the point where he let Bernard shoot himself in the head because he knew that Maeve would be there to bring him back online. And that's why I believe Maeve has this false sense of consciousness, because she went on this false journey and discovered all these things and believes that she's conscious, but truly she isn't. She was told to feel that way. And now that Ford's gone, now it's her time to find her own center and her own journey. And that, as I said before, it's constantly brought back by suffering. When Shakara is killed, Maeve flashes back to William killing her daughter. And that's her flashing back, achieving consciousness, looking back at her reveries, experiencing that suffering, and allowing her to grow. It's just like Dolores going in the barn and pulling the trigger. She used William, and that helped her pull the trigger to escape the confines of her story. And that put her on the journey to go to Escalante and find her inner self. And that ends with Maeve wanting to use her new voice on all these soldiers. So for me, it seems very likely that consciousness goes hand in hand with this new voice that she's discovering. She's able to utilize her mesh network and the authorization she was given because she's becoming self-aware of everything surrounding her. But then we go over to Dolores and Teddy's journey. And we know that based on past episodes, Dolores has almost been questioning Teddy. Because he let Craddock go, almost told Dolores that he isn't operating on her level. And he's not operating the way he's needed to in order to push these hosts to consciousness. And it's tough for Dolores because she's trying to be that Judas steer and bring people to consciousness, but it's so hard for her to do that to Teddy because he's the one thing that she has left. He's the one person that she loves. And throughout this episode, she was trying to get a gauge on Teddy to try and see where he stood, to see if he was holding her back, and to see what she could do to help him. We see that Dolores plans to strip the train and prepare it for speed as they drive it into the mesa. And that's because Dolores wants to rescue her father back. And it seems very likely that she will. We know that they have Abernathy at the Mesa, and we know that Ashley is going to be there. And by the looks of the shot, it looks like Teddy is trying to rescue Abernathy. You can even see his face on the code in the background. And we know that they'll arrive just in time because Charlotte says to Bernard in a previous episode that they still need him. They didn't get the data from him yet. Another interesting scene that we see is the state of Clementine. She's been kind of operating as one of Dolores' henchmen. But here we see that there's still a piece of Clementine inside. She's repeating the very script that she used to say as the new Clementine is reciting that script. And we see Teddy here get very confused because he recognizes Clementine saying that to him in the first season, but it's coming from the wrong person or the wrong face. It's like he's shocked to see the new Clementine. After this, we see Dolores and Teddy go to the place they always used to go. And Teddy remembers someday, and he thinks now is the time for them to finally run away together. The thing that they always talked about. And this is important because Teddy feels like he's finally free, and he's discovering who he is every day. But the ironic thing is what he wants to do is to run away together was programmed in him to want to do with Dolores. It was the backbone of their storyline. And after Dolores hears this, she talks to Teddy about the cows having blue tongue. And this is so significant because it really gives us a picture of what Dolores' motives are. She says that her father Abernathy had to deal with a case of blue tongue. The cows were getting sick, and he found out that it wasn't spreading from cow to cow, but it was spreading from the flies. And the flies foreshadow humanity. How do you stop something that is small? How do you stop something that has wings? It's an enemy that's unavoidable. And Teddy's suggestion is to simply build a shelter until the flies pass. And that's because Teddy is kind, and Dolores says that. And this is where Dolores gets the reputation of being a villain, because in order for her to achieve what she has to achieve, she cannot be kind. For her to have the hosts reach consciousness, she has to be the villain to push them to the center of the maze. In order to make sure that they're safe from humanity, she has to be the villain to make sure they never come back and they leave them alone. And this is where she tells Teddy that Abernathy took all of the sick, all the wounded, and burned them. And it was a pyre that lasted for days. And all the smoke kept the flies away because flies hate smoke. And I feel like this has a lot of parallels to what we're seeing with the bodies in the water. And it provides a big context for what Dolores wants. She's taking hosts that aren't ready to make it to the Valley Beyond and use them as bait for the humans. And what we learn in Bernard's storyline is 1/3 of them have been completely wiped. They're virgin bodies, almost like they haven't been used. And that completely suggests that these 1/3 of the bodies in the water have been transferred into new bodies. And this water, this flooding, and these bodies in it is almost Dolores' smoke. And I think it's going to be used effectively to buy them time. It cuts off the humans having access to them, and it allows Dolores to access the weapon, to prepare for a fight. And the bodies are but a distraction. And we see that it's a distraction that's worked pretty well so far. Malling tells Strand that they removed about 50% of the bodies, and right now they're lowering the water level, so we'll start to see that valley reappear. It seems like Dolores blocked the valley to keep them from following them. And that will probably buy Dolores just enough time, so she can utilize this weapon that she's after in the Great Valley Beyond. Now we see more development with Dolores and Teddy. And Dolores finally tells Teddy that she was honestly debating her feelings for him, because she's trying to dissect what's real and what was given to her by code. And she made the decision on her own that Teddy is the one for her, that their love is true. But the problem is that Dolores says that she saw Teddy so clearly that she knows that he is not going to make it. So we see some symbolism when Dolores brings Teddy in the room and we see a rotting cow, because that represents what she was talking about earlier. It's the cows that are sick and are going to be put on the pyre as a distraction, which we see that Teddy is. He's in the water. And it's Dolores' feeling that some of us have to survive and some of us have to burn. So she ends up holding Teddy down and ends up making a change that is so extreme that it doesn't guarantee that he's going to hold together. Now, I think this scene was actually removed from the episode that was aired like a while back for reviewers or screeners. And it was showed that Teddy's attributes were affected. And we see this happen with Rebus where Bernard affected his attributes, but he didn't need a reset and he was fine. So it'll be interesting to see how much Dolores changes him. But I think here there's a bigger picture. The fact that Dolores led Teddy on in a sense, and she does have his feelings for him, she wants Teddy to become conscious. And she put him through that trauma, and his character's going to change, but ideally I think Dolores just wants Teddy to form himself. She can change his attributes all she wants. At the end of the day, Teddy will eventually find himself. That's why I think Teddy that we see in the water and is rescued, I think his body is virgin, because I think he was transferred into a new one. But the one thing with Dolores that I don't completely understand is what is her criteria for hosts that deserve to make it to the Great Valley Beyond? Because I would say that all hosts deserve to make it to the Great Valley Beyond because they all deserve to achieve consciousness. So it will be interesting to see how Dolores' motives move going forward. But I'm very confident that at the end of this season, it will be revealed that Dolores is not this villain that she's been cut out to be. Everything she's done is strategically done to help the hosts. And we get a glimpse of that when she's talking to Teddy, when she's tearing up and says in order for them to grow, they all need to suffer. And that's unfortunately the role that she has to take. She has to be that suffering. Or else their species will be eliminated by the humans. And lastly, I want to talk about Bernard's storyline. And the first significant thing is we see Strand in the control center looking amongst a lot of dead people. And it zooms in on a soldier holding a bloody knife. And this is extremely significant, because it's foreshadowing what we're going to see next episode. We already see in episode 1 that there's a dead bear, and it's very curious as to why the bear is even there. And I'm going to bet that this isn't just some random bear. I think this bear was probably altered by code. And I think there's two combatants who could have changed the code. There's Dolores and the guy following her who's able to do that, or there's Bernard. And Bernard seems like the most likely one since he's going to be coming into contact with the cradle, which may give him an extra power of controlling wildlife in the vicinity. But I'm not 100% sure. But the significance of this bear is that who it's going to kill. This woman who's on the ground dead fought the bear, and she's now dead, and we see her in the preview for next episode with Charlotte. So this bear attack and this woman will most definitely be involved in the attack Dolores does on the mesa to get Abernathy back. And we see Bernard is going to be standing there in shock, kind of watching everything unfold. And it's pretty much 100% that they're going to rescue Abernathy, because Charlotte talks to Bernard in the present timeline and says that he keeps slipping out of her fingers, and they still haven't gotten the information. And we see clips in the trailer to prove this when we see Teddy wearing a military garb, and he puts his gun seemingly on Ashley. Even in the background, you see Abernathy's head in his own code. So I think they're going to break Abernathy out. Another interesting thing is the water and the situation it's in. Right now, they've removed 50% of the flooded valley. And right now, they're clearing out the hosts. And the one key thing here is location. Because where this valley is, where this water has been overflowed, is pretty much the same area where we see William and Dolores in Season 1. This location leads to Escalante. And where this overflow is right by Escalante. We see Bernard leave Escalante and drive to the location. And we learn from multiple characters this season that Dolores is heading west. William is heading west. So I think where they're going is across the water. And that provides more context to Dolores' discussion with Arnold, where he says he saw himself on a beach, and on the distant shore he saw Dolores. And that goes to speak that on one side, we see what's going on, and then the Great Valley Beyond is across on the distant shore. And that feeds into what Maeve says, that in this new world you can be whoever you want to be. That's on the new shore on the other side of the valley. And in this valley, it seems like a third of these people that Dolores has left in the water have been transferred to new bodies, because we learn that a third of the IP is completely blanked out. And on top of that, the cradle has been destroyed. And the reason why that's so important that they can't recover anything from the cradle is because the cradle is a simulation that tests the stories of all of their hosts and the storylines. It's pretty much a back catalog of everything they've ever done. And the fact that that's destroyed means that everything needs to be started from scratch. All their IP is gone. So being able to reopen Westworld after this tragedy will be very hard to do. But I believe the cradle has even more significance. We know that Bernard is going to go to the cradle next episode. Him and Elsie are going to go to the mesa and stumble upon the cradle. This is going to allow Bernard to see all of the storylines that have ever been created. And you can also run people through simulations based on new storylines. So maybe there Bernard can look back at his storyline, if it's in there, and potentially find that human control module that he printed. Or maybe Bernard is looking for a new plotline that's yet to be revealed. And that's the difference between Bernard and Dolores. I think Bernard is going to utilize the cradle to go after what he wants, whereas Dolores is going to burn it and destroy it. Because that's the confines of who the hosts are. If you destroy the stories in the back catalog, it helps her people push to make their own selves. And that's what we learned in previous episodes. We learned in episode 3 that floors through 42 and 45 are on fire. And now in this episode we learn that it's been destroyed. And even further evidence of the cradle that's blowing my mind, and I need to look into it further, is I think all of these discussions with Arnold and Dolores is actually Bernard and Dolores, but it's done through the cradle. One key thing to look at is if you look at every interaction with Arnold and Dolores, that's seemingly a flashback, the dimensions of the screen are different. But then in another instance, we see Bernard have flashbacks and see Arnold with Dolores, but their dimensions of the screen aren't changed. So I'm not 100% sure now, but I think that Dolores is utilizing the cradle against Bernard. And that would explain why Bernard in that scene says that he was lost in thought. He really just entered the conversation. He entered the simulation. And then he talks about the dream he had where he woke up on the beach. Well, that actually happened. Dolores could be picking his brain and understanding what he did, running it through a simulation. But I guarantee we're going to be getting answers next episode, because even in the preview, we see Arnold discussing with Dolores in the same format. And Dolores stops and says that he did not say it like that. And this raises multiple questions. It's almost like William and James Delos, when William did that interview to see if the cognition was lined up. It looks like Dolores is now doing that with Bernard, correcting him, saying that Arnold actually didn't say that in this situation. Another big thing I want to point out is it seems like Dolores could utilize the cradle to download her memories that she had of Arnold to Bernard. That would explain why his past reveries, some of them are linked up to Arnold and Dolores and not necessarily himself. So I think this cradle could be utilized to potentially move on new memories or storylines from Dolores to Bernard. And I think Bernard is being used and run through a simulation by Dolores. This is a theory I need to flesh out way more, but these interactions between Arnold and Dolores don't seem as they seem. It seems more like Bernard is discussing with Dolores, and Dolores is trying to piece something together. So I would think that the cradle gets destroyed at the Mesa, but I think in the Great Valley Beyond, where William has his biggest mistake, I think a type of cradle technology could also be there. And that would help aid transfer humans to hosts. And it could be useful, and the reason why we're seeing this interaction between Bernard and Dolores. But anyways, please let me know what you guys think in the comment section down below. I'm sorry this episode wasn't as fleshed out. I'm moving right now, so I have a lot going on. I apologize. I'm considering doing a live chat very soon, so please let me know if you guys are interested in doing a live discussion. But until next time, I'll see you guys later.